Hey there. Tonight we're heading back to a year that forgot the rules of weather. A year when July looked like January, when people watched snow fall on their gardens and wondered if God had switched the seasons just to make a point. It's a story of silence more than violence, of gray skies and quiet fear. So, get comfortable. We're going somewhere cold, quiet, and a little bit impossible, the year 1816, when the world forgot how to be warm. It began quietly, which is how most disasters like to start. No thunder, no trumpets. Just a dimness in the air that no one could quite explain. At first, people thought it was just bad weather. A stubborn gray that clung to the sky, day after day, like a guest who didn't understand hints. The farmers complained, the priests prayed, and everyone waited for the sun to act like itself again. Didn't. The calendar said summer, but the world had other plans. Snow fell in June. Frost coated the wheat in July. Lakes froze in August. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Cows refused to give milk. And the apple blossoms turned black before they could ripen. People would later call it the year without a summer, but at the time it just felt like confusion with a side of hunger. The real cause was nowhere near them. On the other side of the world, in what is now Indonesia, Mount Tambora had erupted a year earlier in April 1815. It was one of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history, roughly 100 times stronger than Mount St. Helens. The mountain itself lost nearly half its height, blowing its top into the stratosphere and sending a fine dust of ash and sulfur into the sky. The world didn't hear the explosion itself, but it would hear the echo soon enough. The ash circled the globe, cloaking sunlight in a pale veil. Crops withered, animals died, and people began to realize that the heavens were not as predictable as they'd hoped. In New England, snow fell on blooming fields. Witnesses swore it was thick as flour, layering green leaves in white silence. Frost came back every few nights to check on its work, just in case anything had survived. The farmers, who'd already planted, tried to replant. They failed. In some places, it snowed again before they could try a third time. They began to slaughter their livestock. Better to eat the animals now than watch them starve later. The smell of smoke and desperation replaced the scent of hay. Across the ocean, Europe was even worse off. France was still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars, its farms ruined, its treasury empty. Britain was struggling to feed its industrial towns. The weather struck like a second invasion. Entire harvests vanished. Bread prices tripled. People rioted. In Switzerland, where the mountains already felt close enough to the sky to touch its moods, the clouds turned darker still. Snowstorms arrived in midsummer. Cattle froze in their pastures. Families burned furniture, books, anything that would burn, because even trees were too wet to catch. In that gray summer, travelers told strange stories. Of skies that glowed copper at noon. Of sunsets that looked like spilled blood. Of the moon rising blue instead of silver. Painters tried to capture it. Poets tried to describe it. Priests tried to explain it. None succeeded. The air itself had changed, and color had become unreliable. In London, scientists noticed the haze but could only guess. They thought perhaps it was from Arctic ice melting or some new kind of atmospheric sickness. No one connected it to a mountain on the other side of the world. After all, the world was still pretending it was smaller back then. A collection of separate stories instead of one shared page. The wind disagreed. Meanwhile, rumors spread faster than reason. Some said the sun was dying. Others whispered that it was Judgment Day, that the wars had finally offended heaven. People began to confess things they hadn't done, just in case. And when confession didn't work, they turned to superstition. They wore charms, burned herbs, prayed to saints, and blamed strangers. When the world gets cold enough, logic always thaws first. But amid all that unease, strange new ideas were born. In Geneva, A group of travelers rented a villa to escape the endless rain. Among them were a young poet named Percy Shelley, his lover Mary, and their friend Lord Byron, all restless, all bored. The days were too dark for sailing, the nights too cold for walking. So they lit candles, locked the doors, and challenged each other to write ghost stories. Mary, 20 years old and sleepless, dreamed of lightning and corpses, of a man trying to reanimate death itself. When she woke, she began writing Frankenstein. You could say the darkness had inspired her, or maybe it had simply reflected her world. Elsewhere, the cold brought invention instead of art. In America, a man named Carl Drees realized that horses were dying because no one could feed them. He invented a simple two-wheeled contraption that didn't need feeding, a running machine, the ancestor of the bicycle. Across Europe, desperate farmers tried to grow new crops on failing soil. Some discovered that one strange plant from the Andes, the potato, could survive where wheat had not. It began as an act of hunger and ended as the foundation of modern agriculture. Every famine rewrites the menu. Still, for most, there was no silver lining. Just gray upon gray. Villages along the Rhine reported starving families roasting bark for supper. In Ireland, mothers boiled nettles and moss. In parts of Germany, beggars traveled in caravans, carrying signs that read bread or blood. And in France, people ground bones into flour and pretended not to notice the taste. A witness described a countryside silent except for the wind and the sound of crying. It was a quiet apocalypse. No explosions, no armies, just the slow unraveling of certainty. Historians later estimated that tens of thousands died directly from famine, and hundreds of thousands more from the diseases that followed. Cholera spread through weakened bodies. Typhus found new homes in unwashed blankets. The weather made everyone equal in suffering, which is not the kind of equality anyone wants. And yet somehow life went on. People adjusted in ways both absurd and miraculous. Bakers invented new recipes that didn't require yeast. Families took to sleeping in barns with animals for warmth. Priests held mass at midnight because daylight had become unreliable. The world didn't end, it just learned to live in half-light. Civilization, it turns out, doesn't need comfort to survive. It only needs habit. That's the strange thing about 1816. It was one of the worst years to be alive, and yet, looking back, it also feels oddly alive. A time when humanity trembled and improvised, inventing hope out of hunger. The world got colder, but it didn't stop. It just changed rhythm, like a heartbeat slowing in sleep. The snow melted eventually, the skies cleared, but the memory of that summer, the one that froze, never really thawed. The thing about hunger is that it doesn't happen all at once. It starts quietly, like a rumor. A loaf of bread that costs a little more this week than last. A neighbor who stops smiling when you ask about her hens. A field that should be green but looks the same gray as the sky. And then one morning, you wake up and realize the world itself has gone hollow, and you are living inside its echo. That was Europe in the summer of 1816. The newspapers didn't call it a famine yet. They said shortage or disturbance. Polite words that made suffering sound like a scheduling error. But in the cities, people could smell hunger. It had a scent. Damp flour, boiled weeds, moldy rye. Mothers began watering milk, stretching it into thin meals for children who were too quiet to cry. Bakers kept their doors locked, afraid of mobs. Grain merchants hired guards, and those who couldn't afford guards or grain prayed. The riots began in England. They always do when bread goes first. In East Anglia, farmers' carts were overturned by hungry crowds. In Devon, the mob broke into mills, demanding the flour they had ground for the rich. The soldiers arrived too late and too angry. They fired warning shots that no one took as warnings. When the smoke cleared, the official reports called it disorder, but the witnesses called it something older, desperation wearing a human face. France followed, its streets echoing with old revolutionary slogans. It had been barely a year since Napoleon's fall, and now the same peasants who had marched for liberty were marching for bread. Some thought it was divine punishment for killing their king. Others said it was a second revolution. One fought not for freedom but for survival. No one knew which idea was more dangerous. In Switzerland, where the cold hit hardest, even the well-fed began to panic. Inns turned away travelers. Towns closed their gates. Locals told tales of strangers stealing babies to eat, of wolves hunting in packs through mountain passes. Some of those stories were true. A few weren't. But in the dark, no one could tell which was which. The weather never improved. Each sunrise promised warmth and then broke that promise before noon. Rain fell in sheets that flattened crops. Frost followed at night to finish the job. The rivers overflowed and then froze again. It was a year when even the water didn't know what it wanted to be. And through it all, the sky stayed strange. Painters in Germany began to notice that sunsets had changed color. The usual gold and red were gone, replaced by streaks of violet and copper. The air was filled with fine volcanic dust, invisible but omnipresent, a reminder that somewhere, the earth had sneezed and everyone else had caught the fever. JMW. Turner would later make his career painting that glow, turning disaster into beauty. But at the time, no one thought it was beautiful. It was just wrong. In America, the cold crossed oceans like an uninvited guest. In New England, farmers called it 1800 and froze to death. Snow fell on the 4th of July. People chopped down their fruit trees for firewood. Whole families abandoned their farms, loading what little they had onto wagons and heading west, toward the promise of a climate that still remembered how to be warm. Some made it. Many didn't. The exodus reshaped the country, scattering people like seeds across the continent. The weather, in its own way, redrew the map. It wasn't just people who moved. Ideas did, too. A man named Joseph Smith grew up during those gray years, watching his family lose everything to frost. Decades later, he would found a new religion based on visions of struggle and endurance. The world's chill, it seems, leaves marks deeper than frostbite. Meanwhile, in India and China, the monsoons failed. Droughts came. Crops withered. Famine followed like a shadow that had finally caught up. In Yunnan province, villagers sold their children for rice. In Bengal, the price of food tripled. All of it traced back to that single volcanic breath, one mountain's temper tantrum echoing across continents. But the people didn't know that. They only knew that the weather had turned against them. Priests, of course, tried to explain. They spoke of sin, of judgment, of an angry sky demanding repentance. And people listened because it was easier to believe in punishment than coincidence. In Ireland, villagers held processions, walking barefoot through rain, chanting prayers to saints who had gone suspiciously silent. In Bavaria, priests carried relics through the streets, hoping to charm the sun back out. It didn't work. Heaven, if it was listening, had nothing to say. But even in the dark, there were small rebellions against despair. In a village near the Alps, a baker began baking hope bread. Loaves so small and thin they were almost symbolic, sold for a single coin so everyone could afford at least the illusion of plenty. In France, starving children sang songs about the sun returning, their voices shaky but determined. In England, artists painted green fields from memory, refusing to surrender to gray. It didn't bring back the harvest, but it made people remember that color still existed somewhere. And yet, behind every quiet act of resilience, there was a deeper fear that maybe this wasn't temporary. Maybe the world was changing forever. Without scientific understanding, imagination filled the gaps. Some whispered that volcanoes were the mouths of hell, and that the devil was breathing through them. Others said the moon was sick, or that comets had poisoned the air. A few even blamed the new machines, the steam engines and factories that had begun to fill cities with smoke. "We've angered the heavens," one pamphlet warned, "and the sky is turning against us." It wasn't true, but it felt right, which was good enough. By autumn, there was nothing left to harvest. The fields were brown, the rivers low, the barns empty. People began eating whatever they could find: nettles, bark, leather, even sawdust mixed with flour. Some died quietly, others didn't. In the French countryside, corpses lay unburied because the ground was too hard to dig. In Germany, dogs were slaughtered before they could starve. A diary from the time reads simply, "There is no more color in the world." But then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the cold started to ease. The clouds thinned, the sun returned, pale and shy, like someone embarrassed to be late. The first warm breeze of 1817 felt like a miracle, though no one trusted it. After a year of betrayal, even warmth felt suspicious. When the snow finally melted for good, it revealed a changed world. Crops would take years to recover. Populations had shifted. Art, science, and even faith had moved in new directions. The volcano had erupted for a week, but its aftershocks had rewritten a century. And in some ways, the world never truly went back. When the skies finally began to clear, it wasn't relief that people felt first. It was disbelief. They'd been waiting so long for warmth that when it returned, they didn't quite trust it. The first patches of blue sky looked wrong, like lies painted over the truth. The birds began to sing again, but their songs sounded out of place in a world that had learned to listen for silence. Europe was exhausted, not just physically but spiritually. The wars had ended, the emperor was gone, and now the heavens themselves had tried to erase the survivors. Villages were half empty, farms stood abandoned. The roads were filled with wanderers, some looking for work, some for food, some for a reason not to lie down and stop. And amid that drifting world, governments tried to make sense of what had just happened. In London, Parliament debated relief funds for the poor, but the rich resisted. They called it natural correction, as if starvation were a lesson in economics. In France, officials ordered new grain imports, but there was nothing left to import. Everyone's fields had failed. And in Switzerland, where the mountains had trapped the cold longest, whole families emigrated. Some went south, others west. They packed what little survived, their tools, their memories, and set out for somewhere that might remember the word summer. That was the quiet beginning of something vast. The famine pushed people to move, and in moving, they redrew the world. Thousands of Europeans boarded ships for America, believing the stories of fertile land and endless sky. They didn't know yet that the same cold had touched the other side of the ocean too. But it didn't matter. Movement felt like control, and control was something no one had felt for years. In New England, where the frost had destroyed even the apple trees, entire communities abandoned the coast. They loaded wagons with the last of their belongings and headed west, toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward the idea of something better. The newspapers called it pioneer spirit. The people called it survival. Along the roads, you could hear the creak of carts and the slow sound of feet. An orchestra of migration, scored in hunger. What historians later called the westward expansion began, in truth, with bad weather. It wasn't just ambition that drove people across a continent. It was the memory of frozen fields and empty plates. The American frontier, so often romanticized in later years, was born from the same volcanic ash that had fallen half a world away. But hunger doesn't just move bodies. It moves minds. After 1816, the world's faith in stability cracked. Philosophers wrote about fragility. Painters obsessed over light. It's no coincidence that Romanticism bloomed in that era. Art obsessed with nature's power, with storms, with loneliness. People had seen beauty turn dangerous, and they couldn't stop looking at it. Writers filled their pages with ghosts and ruins. Poets described mountains not as peaceful, but as monstrous. Painters like Turner began to smear skies with red and orange, mimicking the volcanic haze that had haunted them. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. The world had looked into the abyss, and the abyss, inconveniently, had been rather beautiful. In Geneva, the young writers from Villa Diodati carried their sleepless nights into legend. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published 2 years later, a tale of creation turned catastrophe, of a man who thought he could master nature only to be destroyed by it. It wasn't just fiction, it was a mirror held up to 1816. The lightning, the isolation, the hubris, the remorse. It all began with that stormy summer. The creature, some say, was humanity itself. Lord Byron, who had watched the same endless rain through the same dark windows, wrote Darkness, a poem about a world where the bright sun was extinguished, and even the stars died one by one. He had seen the real version already, he just wrote it prettier. The cold had turned poets into prophets. But for most people, art didn't matter. They didn't have time to read or paint or write. They had to rebuild. And rebuilding meant accepting that the old world was gone. Farmers began to adapt to the new climate. Shorter growing seasons, hardier crops, fewer assumptions. Some stopped trusting the sky altogether, building glass houses to control their own weather. It was the birth of modern agriculture, born from the death of certainty. Governments, too, began to notice the power of nature. They started keeping weather records, measuring temperatures, rainfall, and pressure. The science of meteorology was born, ironically, from the failure of the heavens to behave. People had learned the hard way that ignorance was expensive. And somewhere in all this chaos, religion shifted. The Great Famine had shaken faith in divine mercy, but it hadn't destroyed it, it had complicated it. Churches began preaching endurance instead of salvation. Sermons turned from promises to cautions. The world is fragile. Life is temporary. Humility is safety. In places where churches collapsed, new movements rose. Spiritualism, mysticism, doomsday sections. It's easy to believe in the end of the world when you've already lived through a rehearsal. Even in far corners of the globe, echoes of Tambura's breath lingered. In India, British colonial officers recorded a dreadful scarcity and mass migrations. In China, families fled to the south, abandoning villages that would never recover. In the Arctic, explorers noted strange glacial growth. Ice reclaiming sea that had once been open. The planet had shivered, and every corner felt it differently. And yet, for all the devastation, something curious began to grow in its place. Awareness. For the first time, people started to realize the world was connected, that what happened in one hemisphere could ruin crops in another. The idea of global wasn't political yet, it was agricultural. A volcano had written the first lesson in climate science. By 1818, the world had warmed again. The sun burned brighter, the sky looked blue, and crops began to return. But people didn't forget. You can't forget a year when summer betrayed you. The memory stayed like a scar under the skin, visible only when the weather turned strange again. When later generations told stories of 1816, they softened it, turned it into a curiosity. The year it snowed in summer, they said, as if it were a magic trick or a quaint anomaly. But for the ones who lived it, there was nothing quaint about hunger. It was a slow disaster, the kind that doesn't make heroes, only survivors. And survival leaves quieter marks. Even now, when the sky turns gray and the air feels wrong, there's a whisper of that year still in it. Somewhere beneath our comfort, the world remembers what it's capable of. And maybe that's why this story endures, not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. disaster doesn't end. It just waits for better timing. When you look back on the year 1816, it's tempting to treat it like a single strange season, an isolated moment when the world briefly lost its balance. But the truth is, the year didn't end when the calendar said it did. It lingered. It stayed in the soil, in the rivers, in the stories people told about the sky. The cold had moved in, and it refused to leave politely. By 1817, the sun had technically returned, but it didn't feel the same. The light was weaker, thinner, as if it had been filtered through exhaustion. The people who'd survived were thinner, too. You could see it in their faces, in their clothes. Hunger had a way of rewriting bone and habit. Even when food became available again, most people ate slowly, suspiciously, as if the warmth might vanish mid-meal. Governments tried to convince everyone that the worst was over. England promised a prosperous harvest. France organized festivals of Thanksgiving, though the wheat still came up stunted. Switzerland held parades to celebrate the return of summer, but the parades looked half-hearted. No one quite believed the world yet. Trust, once lost, doesn't regrow as easily as crops. Still, the world was changing in quieter, permanent ways. The Great Migration westward across the Atlantic accelerated. The United States, still young and hungry for land, opened new territories, offering what Europe could no longer guarantee: space, soil, and sunlight. Letters from settlers described wide rivers and endless plains, though most forgot to mention the mosquitoes, the droughts, and the loneliness. Hope doesn't survive contact with realism, but it travels farther. Whole families sold their possessions for a ticket to somewhere less predictable. Ships left from Liverpool, Le Havre, and Bremen, full of farmers and artisans clutching seeds that had failed them once but might still work somewhere else. The cold had turned migration into instinct, like birds flying toward warmth they couldn't see. Meanwhile, the people who stayed behind learned new lessons about fragility. Economies began to modernize not because of progress but because of fear. Mechanization took root in the ashes of famine. Grain mills became industrial. Storage techniques improved. Transport systems expanded. In trying to outthink hunger, humanity built the early skeleton of globalization. Necessity is a cruel teacher, but it's thorough. In Germany, a wave of scientists began cataloging everything: crops, temperatures, soil types, rainfall. They wanted to understand why the weather had betrayed them. Out of their obsession grew meteorology, the idea that you could measure the sky instead of praying to it. They built instruments that recorded air pressure, wind direction, and humidity, all to predict the unpredictable. The urge wasn't curiosity, it was defense. If you can't stop the storm, at least you can see it coming. But the memory of that year never stopped haunting culture. Artists, who had lived through that long gray, couldn't let go of its palette. Turner painted skies that looked like sunsets burning through ash. Caspar David Friedrich filled his canvases with ruins, ice, and isolation. Figures turned away from the viewer, staring into fog. The world had discovered melancholy, and it was profitable. The poets turned that melancholy inward. They wrote about decay, about loneliness, about the futility of control. Nature stopped being beautiful and started being sublime, meaning larger than you, indifferent to your survival. Before Tambora, people thought the world revolved around human stories. After Tambora, they knew better. Even music caught the tone. Composers wrote symphonies full of slow movements and unresolved chords, mirroring a world that had learned how to shiver in tune. The Romantic era wasn't born out of love or nostalgia. It was born out of weather, out of the humbling realization that human certainty could be erased by a mountain's bad mood. Some of the changes were invisible but profound. The famine had decimated livestock, forcing farmers to experiment with new breeding methods. Those experiments led to more resilient herds, and eventually to the agricultural revolutions that would feed industrial cities. The cold had killed millions, but it had also forced innovation that would feed billions later. Evolution works that way sometimes. Progress born from panic. Even science itself shifted tone. The Enlightenment's optimism, its faith in reason, began to frost over. The idea that humanity could master nature started to feel naive. Philosophers began asking quieter, more frightened questions. Not can we control the world, but can we survive it? It was the beginning of modern anxiety, subtle, sophisticated, and global. The irony, of course, was that no one in 1816 had truly known what had caused it. The connection between the eruption of Mount Tambora and the global chill wouldn't be fully understood until the late 19th century. The scientists of the time couldn't imagine that a mountain in Indonesia could dim the skies in Paris. The world was still too big for them to comprehend, and that ignorance made it feel haunted. But Tambora had already written its lesson. The planet is one body, and when it catches cold, every limb trembles. We just hadn't learned to listen yet. In the villages that had survived, new superstitions bloomed. Farmers planted charms with their seeds. Some whispered that singing to the earth could keep frost away. In some parts of Germany, children were told that the snow of 1816 had been sent by witches who hated laughter. In others, they were told it was God's way of reminding humanity to stay humble. Maybe both were true in their own poetic logic. Even in far-off places untouched by famine, the echoes were strange. In the Caribbean, sunsets glowed unnaturally red, confusing sailors who thought they were sailing into storms. In China, the temperature drops changed migration patterns of birds and insects, leading to years of unpredictable harvests. The entire world, in subtle ways, had been knocked off rhythm. It would take decades to find its balance again. And as the balance returned, people forgot the way people always do. The children who had survived grew up, married, and told stories about the year it snowed in summer. The horror softened into folklore. The gray skies became anecdotes. The hunger turned into metaphor. But the world, beneath that layer of nostalgia, remembered. Soil holds memory longer than speech. Rivers remember drought even after they flow again. When later generations spoke of Tambora, they called it distant, exotic, far away. But the truth was that it had already changed everything from fashion to migration, from art to empire. A volcano had written a century's worth of history without meaning to, and humanity had learned briefly that it was smaller than the sky. There's something strangely comforting about that in hindsight, the idea that all of us, even the grandest empires, live at the mercy of clouds. The earth doesn't notice borders. It doesn't care about kings. It just breathes, and sometimes that breath is ash. The summer of 1816 ended, eventually, but its shadow stayed, quiet, invisible, stitched into the background of every warm day that came after. The world had been reminded what cold could do, and deep down it never forgot. When warmth finally returned to the fields, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like amnesia. The soil began to breathe again. The trees put out hesitant buds, and people stepped outside their homes like survivors leaving a battlefield. But the scars were everywhere, etched into the landscape, carved into habit, stitched into memory. The world after 1816 wasn't the same world that had gone into it. The air felt different, thinner somehow, as if the atmosphere itself had learned caution. Across Europe, people whispered about how quiet the birds sounded, how the colors looked faded. It was as if nature had lost its confidence. And perhaps it had. The first harvests after the famine were cautious things. People planted with nervous hands, watching the sky as if it might change its mind again. There were new rituals for luck, farmers blessing their plows, women throwing handfuls of flour into the wind, children told not to whistle near fields in case the wind took offense. The old balance between superstition and survival had shifted, and no one was sure which side was safer. In cities, something else was brewing. The famine had cracked open the illusion of stability. People had seen governments fail to protect them, and faith in authority froze alongside the crops. Political discontent began to stir. Quiet at first, like the first tremor before an avalanche. It wasn't revolution yet, not in name, but the hunger had planted seeds of its own. By the 1820s, across Europe, crowds began to gather again, not for bread this time, but for rights. Workers who had watched their wages shrink while the price of food soared started organizing. The same desperation that had led peasants to break bakery windows now fueled something more articulate: the demand for fairness. The cold had taught people how quickly comfort could disappear, and they weren't willing to depend on good weather anymore. In France, pamphlets appeared comparing kings to the sky, both unpredictable, both dangerous. In Germany, students formed secret societies that spoke of unity and reform. Even in England, where tradition clung like ivy, the idea of democracy began to sprout through cracks in Parliament's stone. You could trace those movements, faintly but clearly, back to 1816, to the winter that didn't end and the hunger that refused to stay quiet. Meanwhile, science kept chasing the ghost of that summer. Scholars still didn't understand how 1 year could undo centuries of habit. Some thought comets had poisoned the air. Others blamed sunspots. The word volcano appeared in scientific journals, but no one could connect a distant mountain with a European famine. It was simply too vast to imagine. It would take another 50 years before climatologists pieced it together. The eruption of Mount Tambora, the dust that drifted into the stratosphere, the light scattered across continents. When they did, it changed everything. Suddenly, the weather wasn't divine punishment anymore. It was physics. The sky wasn't a mystery. It was a system. Humanity had found a new kind of faith, data. But faith, even in numbers, doesn't erase fear. And the fear of 1816 lingered. It hid in the way people stocked pantries, in how governments planned grain reserves, in the sudden fascination with climate and crop yield that swept through the 19th century. Even art couldn't stop glancing over its shoulder. The cold was gone, but the memory of fragility stayed vivid. In England, a new fascination with apocalypse crept into literature. Not the fiery end of religious prophecy, but the quiet, gray kind. Stories where the sun disappears, where the world falls silent under snow. Painters filled galleries with storms and shipwrecks. Poets wrote about solitude and frozen hearts. Even as society industrialized, turning cities into furnaces of smoke and progress, part of it still shivered from a memory it couldn't name. In Switzerland, where that strange summer had birthed ghost stories in candlelit villas, Mary Shelley's books spread across Europe. Frankenstein was printed, reprinted, argued over, banned, then adored. Readers saw it as horror, but it was really weather, the moral version of a volcanic winter. A man playing God, punished by his own creation, watching everything he loved freeze around him. It was 1816 in metaphor. Elsewhere, other inventions bloomed from the same frostbitten soil. In Germany, scientists began experimenting with chemical fertilizers. In America, engineers worked on steam-powered threshers and new irrigation systems. In Ireland, the potato became more than a crop. It became identity, insurance against another betrayal from the sky. Humanity had begun designing safety nets, one invention at a time. And still, amid progress and poetry, a quieter transformation took place. The cold had forced people to look beyond their borders. A bad harvest in France meant hunger in England. A storm in India meant shortages in Europe. For the first time, humanity realized it shared one fragile system. The idea of the global had been born not from trade, not from empire, but from weather. Sailors reported strange sunsets still glowing on the horizon. Years later, hues of red and violet that reminded them of the ash that had once circled the planet. And every now and then, when the sky went orange too early, people would stop and look up. Just for a moment. Just to make sure it wasn't happening again. The older generation told stories to the children, half warning, half lullaby. They said, "There was once a summer so cold, the birds forgot how to sing. A year when firewood ran out and even the saints shivered. But we lived through it." The children listened, wide-eyed, not quite believing. Disasters always sound fictional when you've never seen one. But the adults remembered. They remembered the sound of rain that never stopped. They remembered the gray light that flattened everything it touched. They remembered the taste of bark broth, the thinness of silence. And they remembered that the world, however cruel, kept turning. That's the thing about survival, it's rarely triumphant. No one stands on a hilltop and shouts victory when the frost melts. They just breathe, rebuild, and carry the memory forward in the small things. In the way they store grain, in the prayers they mutter at planting time, in the sigh they give when a cold wind hits in July. And while most people tried to forget, a few couldn't stop thinking about it. Scientists, poets, wanderers. They all felt that hum of fragility underneath the new warmth. They began to write it down, to study it, to wonder whether the cold might come again. They were right to wonder, because the earth, in its endless patience, forgets nothing. And somewhere, deep beneath the crust, another mountain was already stirring. The volcano itself, the real culprit, sat half a world away in quiet triumph. By 1816, Mount Tambora was nothing but a shattered crown of stone, its peak blown off, its slopes buried under ash and silence. It had killed almost everyone within 100 miles, wiped out entire islands, erased villages from maps, and yet no one in Europe had even heard its name. That was the strangest part of the story. The world had suffered a disaster it couldn't locate. The skies had dimmed, the crops had failed, and no one knew why. For years, the mystery of the summer that wasn't hovered over everything, unanswered. The idea that one volcano could reach across oceans, across hemispheres, across worlds, it was simply too big for the human imagination at the time. But the imagination caught up. Slowly, sailors brought back stories first. Tales of the East Indies, of ash that had blackened the sea and turned noon into midnight. British traders, mapping their routes through Java and Sumatra, noted that one island seemed to be missing. The maps still showed a mountain called Tambora, but what they found instead was a hollow crater, 9 miles wide and nearly a mile deep. It looked like the Earth itself had taken a bite out of its own tongue. Eventually, scientists pieced it together. The eruption had been so violent that the sound alone had traveled more than 1,000 miles, the loudest noise in recorded history. The ash cloud had risen 30 miles into the stratosphere, where no rain could wash it away. It had drifted across the globe like an invisible ocean current, scattering sunlight, scattering logic. And yet, even once the cause was known, people still preferred the mystery. They liked thinking it was divine or cosmic or symbolic. The truth that one random geological event could throw the entire planet into chaos was almost more terrifying than divine wrath. At least wrath had meaning. A volcano was just geology. In that sense, Tambora did something profound. It made people see the world as unstable. Not morally unstable, physically unstable. A living planet with moods and tempers. A world that didn't revolve around human drama. For centuries, humans had thought of nature as a stage for their own stories. In 1816, the stage cracked, and the actors realized the set was real. By the 1830s, natural philosophers, the early scientists, began studying volcanic dust and its effects on sunlight. They collected samples from glaciers, trapped in ice that still held the ghost of 1816's ash. They started to notice patterns. The way eruptions cooled the climate, the way weather rippled across continents. They didn't have words like climate system or feedback loop yet, but they were beginning to see the outlines of something enormous. Tambora unknowingly had invented modern climate science. But before it became science, it was still mythology. In the islands near the volcano, local legends told of gods who had fought and torn the sky open. Some said the mountain had been punished for pride, trying to grow too tall and touch the heavens. Others said it was the world resetting itself, purging excess heat, exhaling. Every culture found its own way to explain the same event, each version half poetry, half trauma. The Dutch colonists, who ruled the region at the time, wrote clinical reports, lists of casualties, destroyed plantations, lost profits. They never quite understood that they were documenting the beginning of a global transformation. Their ledgers became the fossil record of a catastrophe. Back in Europe, artists were already mining that catastrophe for beauty. The sunsets, those glowing reds and purples created by volcanic dust, became the obsession of painters. J.M.W. Turner's skies blazed with light that wasn't really there anymore, reflections of the invisible ash still drifting above. The very look of romantic art, those fiery horizons, those tragic clouds, came directly from Tambora's palette. The apocalypse had changed how humanity saw color. But color wasn't the only thing it changed. The eruption also reshaped the movement of people and power. The famine it caused pushed migration westward, yes, but it also weakened empires. France's instability deepened. Britain's colonies tightened their grip on food exports. In the east, shortages pushed entire regions into revolt against colonial rule. Tambora didn't just cool the planet, it rearranged it. Some historians argue that even small political ripples trace back to that cold summer. Revolts in Java, food riots in Bengal, population shifts that redrew trade routes. Even the Irish dependence on potatoes, which would lead to its own famine decades later, began in these very years, when the potato proved the only crop stubborn enough to survive the chill. Tambora had planted the seeds of future tragedies. And while governments recovered, individuals carried their private scars. Diaries from the time read like confessions of quiet despair. A Swiss farmer wrote, "I cannot forget how the air felt, heavy and pale. My son says the world will never end, but I think it already did once." Another, from Maine, "We burned everything that would burn, even the Bible pages. I suppose God would understand." It's strange, those who survived rarely described fear. What they described instead was fatigue, a kind of deep cosmic tiredness, the exhaustion of realizing the world could break and that there was nothing anyone could do about it. That realization became the background hum of the 19th century, a century that looked forward with optimism but inward with dread. Steam, steel, progress, all built on the memory of fragility. Even as factories filled cities and machines conquered distance, there was still that quiet understanding underneath, that nature could take it all back whenever it pleased. And in a strange way, Tambora's breath still lingers even now. The way the sky turns orange after certain sunsets. The way the temperature dips unpredictably after an eruption. The way scientists trace volcanic dust in Arctic ice cores and find echoes of 1816 still preserved. A geological fingerprint of fear. The mountain sleeps, but its lesson doesn't. That lesson isn't about death or punishment. It's about humility, about remembering that the earth is not a backdrop. It's the main character and we are only the dialogue. Even now, if you stand on the rim of Tambora's crater, where jungle has crept back over what used to be ash and fire, you can feel it. The silence. The strange stillness that follows something that once tried to end the world. The air is hot and sweet with vegetation again. But deep under the ground, the mountain remembers. And if you wait long enough, if the wind shifts just right, you might imagine you hear it. Not a roar, not a threat, just a low exhale. The kind of sigh the planet gives when it's bored of pretending to be stable. That sigh crossed oceans once. It darkened skies, froze harvests, and rearranged history. And all it took was a single breath of ash. There's a quiet kind of panic that happens when the world doesn't behave. Not the loud panic of war or plague, but the slow, creeping kind, the kind that seeps into dreams and prayer. That's what 1816 left behind. The snow melted, the crops returned, but something deeper had shifted in the human imagination. For the first time, people realized the end of the world wasn't a prophecy. It was a possibility. Before that year, apocalypse had belonged to religion. It came with trumpets and angels, fire and judgment. But after a year where July felt like December and no one could explain why, the idea changed shape. The end of the world didn't need wrath anymore. It only needed weather. Writers began to pick at that thought, quietly at first, then with growing fascination. The poets of Europe, Byron, Shelley, Coleridge, had stared into gray skies long enough to understand how fragile the light was. Byron's darkness captured it perfectly. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished. He wrote it in the same villa where the rain never stopped, his words dripping with the same dampness that haunted every day of that summer. It wasn't prophecy. It was memory, and it spread. Artists began to paint what people secretly feared. Landscapes that looked abandoned, cities lost to ice, mountains swallowing valleys. Friedrich's figures stood small against horizons that stretched too far, too empty. The light in those paintings wasn't illumination, it was warning. The apocalypse, for the first time, was beautiful. In England, Mary Shelley gave it a face. Frankenstein wasn't about monsters or lightning, it was about control or the illusion of it. A man trying to play God and being punished by his own creation. It was, in essence, the story of 1816. The year humanity realized it wasn't running the show. Shelley never said it outright, but she didn't have to. Every storm in her book sounded like that long, sleepless summer over Lake Geneva, when thunder rolled for weeks and the sun forgot how to shine. Even science, normally so proud, so certain, began to sound nervous. Scholars started publishing essays about planetary imbalance, about how the Earth's atmosphere might contain hidden mechanisms of destruction. They didn't have words like climate change yet, but they had dread. The same dread that would echo centuries later, when the vocabulary caught up. There's something oddly poetic about that. The first modern fear of environmental collapse began not with data, but with snowfall on green fields. Meanwhile, religion adjusted its tone. Fire and brimstone sermons gave way to frost and famine. Priests warned that the cold had been divine disappointment, not anger. God wasn't punishing humanity anymore. He was withdrawing warmth literally and figuratively. It was a quieter apocalypse, delivered through clouds instead of thunder. But for ordinary people, theology wasn't much comfort. They'd already seen paradise turn gray. Their grandchildren would inherit the unease, though they wouldn't know where it came from. A generation raised on stories of the year without a summer grew up half expecting disaster. They saved more food. They distrusted blue skies. They built sturdier barns. They passed down lessons that sounded superstitious but weren't. Don't trust a spring that comes too early, they'd say. Don't plant until you feel real warmth. The wisdom of survivors disguised as folklore. The irony is that the worst had already passed. The next few years brought balance back. Gentle seasons, steady harvests, sunlight that looked like sunlight again. And yet, the fear never quite left. The same way you flinch when you walk into a room where something terrible once happened. The room's fine now. It's you who remembers. By the 1820s, Europe began to rebuild its confidence. The cities buzzed again. Industry roared, and the sky filled with smoke that people called progress. But the irony lingered. Just a few years after nature had punished the world with cold, humans started punishing it back with heat. The Industrial Revolution was born out of that uneasy balance, the urge to control what the heavens had once taken away. Steam, coal, machines, power. The world would never be at the mercy of the sky again, they thought. It was the perfect revenge, really. The volcano had darkened the sun, and humanity responded by lighting fires of its own. Of course, those fires would one day darken the sky again, but that's another story. For now, the people of the 19th century could only look back and marvel at how close they'd come to freezing civilization in place. And as they did, the myth of 1816 began to evolve. It went from tragedy to curiosity, from memory to metaphor. People started calling it the year without a summer, a phrase that made it sound almost whimsical, like a missed appointment instead of a global trauma. But in the diaries, the truth still flickered. The survivors didn't call it anything poetic. They called it the year the light died, and it changed how they told stories ever after. You can trace it in the literature of the age, the fascination with ruins, with ghosts, with broken empires and frozen landscapes. You can see it in the rise of Gothic novels, in the haunted castles and gloomy skies that filled every bookshop. The readers of the early 19th century didn't want heroes. They wanted catharsis. They wanted to see the world fall apart beautifully, the way it had in real life. The apocalypse, once a sermon, had become an aesthetic. And beneath it all was the faint hum of a new understanding. That the planet didn't care. That beauty and cruelty could share the same sky. That maybe, just maybe, survival wasn't the point, it was just the habit. Centuries later, scientists would look back on 1816 as the start of climate consciousness, the first time humanity realized it was small enough to be affected and big enough to notice. Artists would call it the birth of modern melancholy. Philosophers would call it the beginning of existentialism. But the farmers who lived through it would just shake their heads and say, "It was the year it snowed in summer." Simple words for a complicated truth. The sky had turned gray, and the world had never been the same color since. By the time the world had truly warmed again, the memory of 1816 had begun to fade. Not vanish, exactly, just retreat into the corners of conversation. It became one of those things people talked about the way they talked about dreams. "Do you remember that summer?" they'd ask. "The one that froze?" And someone would nod and say, "Ah yes, that was the strange year." They said it softly, the way you speak about a ghost who might still be listening. But even when a memory fades, it leaves shape behind. An imprint, like a body that's gone cold but still dents the bed. That's what Tambora did. It left a dent in human thought. Before the cold, people had imagined the future as a straight road. Progress, invention, improvement. After the cold, the road looked less certain, full of bends and cracks, with the weather waiting at every turn. The year without a summer had shown how fragile the idea of tomorrow really was. And in doing so, it invented something we still live with, the future as anxiety. Before 1816, people believed in destiny, the kind written by God or kings or reason. After 1816, they began to believe in probability. If became the most important word. If the sun shines, if the harvest grows, if the world behaves, the vocabulary of hope turned conditional. You can see that change everywhere once you start looking. In science, it showed up as curiosity sharpened by fear. Scientists no longer just wanted to understand the world. They wanted to predict it, to contain it. They built instruments and equations not just out of wonder but out of memory. The barometer on a wall wasn't decoration. It was insurance. A small, brass promise that the sky might not surprise them again. In politics, the same tone crept in. Governments began keeping statistics on rainfall, temperature, population, disease. They called it data collection, but it was really superstition disguised as math. If you could count something, maybe you could control it. If you could measure the world, maybe it would stop changing without permission. And in art, the cold never left. Painters kept chasing those strange skies, that mix of fire and ash that had turned sunsets into theology. Writers filled their pages with storms and loss, cities swallowed by fog, heroes adrift in weather that mirrored their hearts. It wasn't just melancholy, it was realism. They had seen the sky change color, and they were still trying to describe it. The Romantic movement became the world's quiet morning ritual. It wasn't just about beauty or emotion. It was a collective attempt to make sense of insignificance. Humans had watched a mountain sneeze and felt the climate change. There was no going back to confidence after that. But out of that unease came something else, invention. Humans are strange that way. We respond to disaster not just with fear, but with creativity. The cold had broken the pattern, and in the cracks, new ideas started growing. In Germany, a young student named Justus von Liebig began studying how soil worked. He wanted to know why crops failed, why hunger could appear out of clear skies. His experiments would become the foundation of modern chemistry and agriculture. In Britain, engineers began experimenting with coal-driven engines that could transport food faster and farther. Hunger had taught humanity its most important modern lesson. Survival requires logistics. Even literature turned practical in its way. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein wasn't just Gothic horror. It was speculative fiction, the first whisper of science fiction itself. A world changed by weather had created a story changed by invention. Shelley had seen what happened when nature betrayed humanity. Her imagination wondered what might happen when humanity betrayed nature in return. It was prophetic in a quiet, accidental way, the 19th century's first warning that power always has a cost. And then there were the dreamers, the ones who took the lesson differently. To them, the cold summer was proof not of danger but of possibility. If the world could change so suddenly, maybe everything could. Revolutionaries borrowed the imagery of weather for their speeches. The sun will rise again, they promised. The storm will pass. They spoke as if the seasons themselves could vote. Change became a metaphor and then a movement. It's easy to forget how intertwined these things were. Famine and art, science and sorrow. The world didn't divide them neatly back then. A poet could also be a botanist. A priest could also be an astronomer. They all shared one question. Why had the world turned against them? And underneath that, a quieter one. Would it happen again? The fear of recurrence became a kind of superstition in itself. Every strange fog, every cold spell, every eclipse stirred whispers. People began keeping diaries of the weather, jotting down temperatures and moods side by side. The wind is bitter, one might write, and my wife is ill again, as if the sky and the heart were connected, which in a way they are. Somewhere in all this, humanity discovered pattern. Not perfect predictability, but rhythm. They began to notice how one event echoed another, how nature worked in cycles, not miracles. They didn't know it yet, but they were inventing climatology, psychology, and even sociology all at once. The invisible became observable, and the observable became explainable. Slowly, the idea that the world was governed by mood gave way to the idea that it was governed by law. It was a shift so subtle that no one noticed at the time, but it would change everything. And yet, for all that new knowledge, the emotional truth remained. 1816 had made people wary. Hope became something you packed carefully, like bread. You didn't trust it to last. Even as the century marched forward into light and machinery, the shadow of that one cold year followed quietly behind. It lived in the cautious optimism of scientists, in the fatalism of poets, in the obsessive efficiency of engineers. Every smokestack that rose into the sky was, in some subconscious way, a promise. We won't be cold again. Of course, in making that promise, they were setting the stage for a different kind of warmth, the kind that never ends. But for now, in the first decades after 1816, humanity wasn't thinking that far ahead. It was just grateful to have sunlight again, grateful to feel warmth on skin without suspicion. The skies had cleared, the crops had grown, and the memory of ash was finally fading into metaphor. The future, though uncertain, existed again, and that was enough. It's funny, though, the future as we imagine it today, bright, fragile, full of both wonder and doom, was born in darkness. It didn't come from hope, came from weather. Sometimes the world has to freeze before it can begin again. The year without a summer might have ended on the calendar, but it had already slipped into the bloodstream of empires. The frost had bitten deeper than crops. It had nipped at pride. Kings, ministers, and colonial governors alike had been reminded that even the most powerful thrones still sat beneath the same cold sky as everyone else. When Europe shivered, it did not suffer alone. Its reach stretched too far for that. The weather that froze French wheat also touched Caribbean sugar, Indian rice, and Chinese tea. The trade routes that bound continents together were arteries now constricted by the chill. Ships left port full of promises and arrived with apologies. The empires of the early 19th century, so certain of their order, their hierarchies, their progress, discovered briefly and unwillingly that nature outranked them all. The British Empire, at the height of its confidence, felt it first. India's monsoon failed, then returned as a flood. Crops rotted in fields, and famine stalked the countryside. The colonial administration called it a minor irregularity in rainfall, because imperial language had a way of shrinking catastrophe until it fit neatly between bureaucratic margins. But in the villages, people began to whisper that the gods were punishing the foreign rulers. A strange irony, that a mountain eruption in Indonesia could humiliate an empire headquartered in London. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was still young enough to learn humility from weather. The frost had destroyed New England's farms so completely that tens of thousands of families packed their belongings and headed west. It wasn't the gold rush that filled those wagons. It was the memory of hunger. They called it the Great Migration, though it wasn't yet great in numbers. It was great in consequence. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, these states were born out of the ghost of Tambora. When the crops failed in Massachusetts, the future of America moved west. It's strange, looking back, to realize how much geography owes to the sky. And while people moved, empires adapted. Britain began expanding its grain imports from its colonies. Canada, Australia, and India all became part of a global system of insurance against bad weather. The logic was simple. If one region failed, another could fill the gap. It was the beginning of globalization disguised as empire, an attempt to make nature manageable through trade. Of course, that kind of control came with arrogance. The same leaders who once prayed for sunlight now spoke as if they could command it. Agriculture became an act of conquest. Colonies were treated as spare gardens for Europe's appetite, their soils taxed and catalogued like ledgers. Scientists in London and Paris began to talk about improving foreign climates, draining swamps, cutting forests, forcing the tropics into obedience. The idea of civilizing the earth grew alongside the idea of civilizing its people. The lesson of fragility had curdled into ambition. Tambora had humbled the world, and the world had responded by doubling down. In that irony lies the story of the 19th century, a century built on the fear of another cold. Steamships replaced sailboats, carrying food faster across oceans. Telegraph lines followed, so that markets could react to famine in hours instead of months. Refrigeration, canning, railways, all the inventions that fed the modern world can trace their roots back to one shared insecurity: the memory of scarcity. Humanity had stared into an empty pantry and decided never again. But the change wasn't just technological. It was psychological. People began to see the earth as something that could betray them, and therefore something that had to be controlled. The Romantic poets had wept over storms. The industrialists built factories to outshout them. And perhaps nowhere was that shift clearer than in the cities. London, Paris, Berlin. Places that had once been content to follow the rhythm of the seasons now decided to write their own. Coal furnaces burned day and night. The smell of smoke became the smell of security. People began to associate warmth with progress, with civilization itself. Fire was no longer the servant of comfort. It was the symbol of dominion. They didn't realize, of course, that they were trading one kind of climate for another. The soot that darkened factory windows was the first whisper of the next great imbalance. But for now, all they knew was that the cold had been beaten back. And far away, in the places where Tambura's ash had first fallen, new orders were being written in its dust. In the Dutch East Indies, survivors rebuilt under colonial rule. The volcanic soil, rich and newly fertile, grew crops that would fill European markets for decades: coffee, sugar, indigo. The same eruption that had starved Europe now fed it. Disaster had turned to profit, as it so often does. Yet not everyone forgot the cost. The locals remembered Tambora not as a lesson in science or economics, but as a story of mourning. Songs were written about the mountain that spoke and the people who vanished. Children were told not to shout near volcanoes, lest the earth hear them and answer. Their version of history wasn't written in books but in silence, the kind that falls after too much noise. Back in Europe, no one heard those songs. They were too busy writing their own myths of mastery. The weather, once a god, had become a variable. The empire, once fragile, now fancied itself eternal. And yet, beneath the pride, there was still a tremor, a subtle unease. Governments kept grain reserves, just in case. Merchants watched the horizon for signs of strange haze. Priests still mentioned that cold summer in sermons, as a warning against arrogance. People had learned to pretend they'd forgotten, but they hadn't. Memory, like ash, has a way of settling into the smallest corners. Even the volcano itself seemed to understand. Tambora slept, but it wasn't finished. Occasionally, a puff of smoke rose from its crater, a faint reminder that the world still breathed beneath their feet. By the middle of the century, that breathing would inspire a new kind of imagination, the global one. Scientists began speaking of the planet as a single organism. Empires, for all their borders and armies, suddenly looked small on maps. The idea of the world as one interconnected body, what we now take for granted, was born from the same event that had dimmed the sun. It's almost poetic in a bleak way. A volcano in Indonesia explodes. A farmer in France loses his crop. A painter in London finds new colors for sunsets. A poet in Geneva dreams of monsters. A factory opens in Manchester. And somewhere, deep under the crust, the earth keeps turning, oblivious to the chain reaction it set in motion. That's how history really works. Not in neat chapters, but in echoes. One mountain, one breath, and the world rearranges itself. The year it snowed in summer was over, but its shadow kept walking, and it would keep walking for a long, long time. Even after the skies cleared, the cold didn't really leave. It just moved inward. It settled behind the ribs, in the spaces between memory and caution. You could hear it in how people talked, in how they planned, in how they prayed. For those who lived through 1816, summer never felt entirely trustworthy again. The trauma of that year didn't wear the face of shock or hysteria. It wore the face of habit. People started storing more grain than they needed, mending their clothes twice, buying candles in bulk. A kind of quiet hoarding crept into culture, the instinct to prepare for a future that might forget them again. It wasn't paranoia. It was prudence learned from hunger. Farmers became cautious gamblers. They planted extra, diversified crops, rotated fields more carefully. Merchants kept ledgers with new, nervous precision. Even families began to organize themselves differently. Parents raised their children to be adaptable, learn a trade, they said, and learn another just in case. And beneath those practical changes, something deeper shifted. The weather had entered the human imagination. It wasn't just background anymore. It was a participant in life. Every storm, every fog, every oddly cold breeze carried the question. Is it happening again? You can trace this new fear through small things: diaries, sermons, letters. Before 1816, weather was small talk. After 1816, it was philosophy. A woman in Bavaria wrote to her sister, "The clouds look heavy, and I think often of that strange year. I know it was long ago, yet I still feel that sky in my bones." A clergyman in England noted in his parish records, "When the sun shines too pale, the congregation grows quieter." The weather had become a collective memory, shared across borders and generations. In art, that memory became style. Painters began putting weather at the center of the canvas instead of behind it. In older landscapes, the sky was just decoration, a polite frame for human achievement. After 1816, the sky became the story. Its colors swallowed towns. Its light defined emotion. Humanity shrank back to its proper scale. Small, temporary, aware. Writers followed suit. Nature stopped being pastoral and started being psychological. Forests weren't cozy anymore. They were moods. Mountains weren't backdrops, they were metaphors. Even the word melancholy, once a personal ailment, became an atmosphere. People didn't just feel sad, they lived in sadness like weather. That was Tambura's invisible inheritance. It taught people that emotion and climate weren't separate. Both were temperamental, both unpredictable, both capable of collapse. But the cold didn't just rewrite art, it rewired morality. Before the famine, most European societies saw suffering as divine punishment or human fault. Afterward, that explanation didn't fit anymore. Too many good people had starved. Too many faithful ones had frozen. The idea that pain was proof of sin began to crumble. In its place came something new: sympathy. Not the modern kind, the slow, societal version. Charity as survival instinct. Relief funds, public food banks, orphanages, all began to multiply after the famine. Not out of kindness exactly, but out of recognition. People had seen how quickly misfortune could spread. They had watched the innocent suffer beside the guilty. Misery, it turned out, was democratic. So they started protecting one another, awkwardly, imperfectly. The modern idea of humanitarian aid, the notion that you help strangers not because you must, but because it could be you next time, was born in that cold. And in the same breath, guilt found a new home. The rich had survived the famine better, as they always do. But this time, the contrast had been too visible. Nobles had thrown banquets under gray skies, their feasts lit by candles that cost more than the bread they hoarded. When the sun returned, they found their reputations dimmed. Newspapers wrote bitterly about winter wealth. The poor had frozen, and the rich had discovered insulation, both literal and moral. The anger didn't erupt immediately. It simmered. It fermented into resentment, ideology, and eventually politics. The seeds of European revolutions were watered by melted snow. But beyond anger, there was shame. A subtle, generational shame that didn't always know its own name. The grandchildren of those who had survived grew up in comfort but carried the ghosts of hunger in their behavior. They measured, they saved, they distrusted extravagance. Prosperity made them nervous, as if good fortune itself might collapse like a brittle crop. You can still see echoes of it today. Cultures where thrift is virtue, where waste feels like sin. That's not morality. That's inheritance. Even religion absorbed the lesson. Churches softened their theology. The image of a punishing God began to fade. In its place grew the idea of a distant one. Not cruel, just silent. The sermons stopped threatening and started consoling. Faith turned inward, gentler, less certain. The cold had humbled the divine. Meanwhile, scientists, ever allergic to mystery, kept probing for explanations. As they collected climate data, they began to speak of the Earth as an organism, one capable of fevers and chills. For the first time, humanity wasn't separate from nature. It was part of the same body. If the sky got sick, people suffered the symptoms. That realization would take another century to mature, but its first breath came in the early 1800s. Even dreams changed. Psychologists studying early 19th century journals noticed a peculiar pattern. People dreamt of light and heat more often than before. Fire, sun, warmth, symbols of safety. When you take warmth away for long enough, it becomes sacred. In a way, that's what the volcano had done. It had reshaped desire itself. Progress, which used to mean wealth or glory, now meant comfort. The perfect future wasn't one of conquest. It was one with stable weather, full bellies, and reliable light. Modern civilization's obsession with security, with controlling risk, with taming uncertainty, it all traces back to that fragile year when the seasons went on strike. Even the rhythm of time changed. Before 1816, history felt eternal. Afterward, it felt fragile. The notion that the world could simply stop behaving, freeze, darken, unravel, made people aware of endings. The apocalypse was no longer a mythic finale. It was a practical risk. And so the 19th century, for all its optimism, became a century haunted by endings. You can feel it in the literature, the architecture, the philosophy. Beauty grew melancholic. Progress grew anxious. Every cathedral of reason had a crypt beneath it filled with frost. The year without a summer was over. But the century that followed couldn't stop looking back at it. Sometimes at dusk, when the air turned suddenly cold, people swore the light dimmed the same way it had that summer. They'd pause, stare at the horizon, and wait for reassurance. And when the warmth finally lingered, they'd breathe again. Not gratitude, exactly, but relief, because the truth was simple and everyone knew it, even if they didn't say it aloud. The sun was generous, yes, but not obligated. Could always change its mind. By the second half of the 19th century, Europe had convinced itself that it had outgrown fear. The world had been measured, charted, and tamed, or so people said. The railways crisscrossed the land like veins of iron. Telegraph wires carried words faster than weather. And in every capital, factories rose with the solemn confidence of cathedrals. Humanity, it seemed, had finally taken charge of its own climate. If not the sky itself, then at least its fortunes beneath it. But confidence, like warmth, is temporary. The memory of 1816 was still there, only buried under soot and progress. It hummed beneath the rhythm of industry, a kind of low background unease that people couldn't quite name. They called it nervousness, or the fatigue of modern life, or sometimes just melancholy. But the truth was simpler. The world had become too stable, too mechanical, and the human mind hadn't caught up. It still remembered the old fragility. The 19th century is remembered for optimism, but it was an optimism built over old bones. The generation that came after Tambora, those born in the years of hunger, grew into the century's industrialists, scientists, and dreamers. They built railways and factories, yes, but they also built weather stations, observatories, and societies for measuring the unpredictable. They no longer feared the wrath of God. They feared the return of randomness. And so, The age of control began, not just control of machines, but control of nature itself. Every field was fenced, every forest mapped, every river redirected. Farmers learned to read barometers. Sailors trusted charts more than instincts. The earth, once something you prayed to, became something you managed. It worked at first. For a few generations, the illusion held. Cities glowed with gaslight, factories roared, and crops grew in rhythm with calendars and machines. Newspapers no longer printed stories about failed harvests, but about rail expansions and patents. People began to talk about progress, as if it were a season of its own, steady, eternal, self-sustaining. But beneath that rhythm, something older still breathed. Every now and then, a fog thicker than usual rolled through London, turning day into night. Every few years, a drought arrived that ignored every machine, every plan. And in those moments, the collective heartbeat skipped. The ghost of 1816 stirred. Writers noticed it first. The Victorians, for all their manners and tea, were obsessed with decay. Their novels were full of crumbling estates, dying dynasties, vanishing summers. Even their ghost stories were less about spirits than about entropy, the fear that order couldn't hold forever. That's the funny thing about memory. It changes form to survive. The same dread that once stared up at gray skies now lived in literature, architecture, even etiquette. People built greenhouses not just for plants but for reassurance. The illusion that you could put the world in a glass box and keep it behaving. Science, too, developed a new kind of anxiety, precision. Meteorologists, geologists, chemists, they all tried to quantify the chaos that had once frozen their ancestors. They developed thermometers that could read decimals, barometers that could sense shifts invisible to the naked eye. Measurement became a prayer, the hope that enough data might keep the next disaster at bay. The irony, of course, is that the more they measured, the more fragile everything looked. Every law of nature came with exceptions. Every prediction came with margins of error. The universe, once thought clockwork, revealed itself to be a little broken in every gear. Even philosophy began to tremble. Thinkers like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard started asking whether suffering was simply built into the fabric of existence. The old optimism of reason gave way to something colder, existential doubt. The human condition, they said, wasn't progress, it was perseverance. You could almost call it the intellectual echo of that endless winter. Meanwhile, empires carried the illusion of control across oceans. They built railroads through deserts, drained swamps, cut jungles into neat lines on maps. But nature still had its own agenda. The monsoons still came when they pleased. The droughts ignored their calendars, and diseases traveled faster along those same railways that were meant to civilize the world. Tambura's lesson, humility, had been forgotten in the name of management. And yet, not entirely. Every now and then, when another famine struck or another volcano erupted, that lesson whispered its reminder. Krakatoa in 1883, for instance, another eruption in the same region as Tambora, smaller but more visible. The sky turned red again. Sunsets glowed like wounds. And once more, humanity remembered how little it took for the earth to reclaim its voice. Pain, as it turns out, is the most consistent teacher in history. But even as fear resurfaced, fascination followed close behind. People didn't just dread nature anymore. They adored its power. Painters climbed mountains to paint storms. Poets wrote about waves, avalanches, and fire. The sublime, the beauty of terror became fashionable. The same instinct that had made medieval peasants pray now made gentlemen in waistcoats write sonnets about thunderstorms. In that way, Tambora had achieved something remarkable. It had turned fear into art. It also turned fragility into ambition. The 19th century's obsession with invention wasn't just curiosity, it was compensation. Every new machine, every scientific breakthrough, Every gleaming World's Fair exhibit was a small act of defiance against memory. We can build our own weather, it seemed to say. We can make our own warmth. And for a while they believed it. But underneath the steam engines and glass conservatories, the world was still the same. An unpredictable planet orbiting an indifferent sun. The memory of cold had simply been converted into fuel, both literal and emotional. Coal replaced ash. Heat replaced hunger. Control replaced faith. That's the great irony of history. We keep responding to yesterday's disaster by building tomorrow's. The Victorians didn't know it yet, but the smoke rising from their chimneys was the first breath of a new kind of storm. One that wouldn't come from mountains, but from themselves. They thought they were escaping the year without a summer. They were, in fact, preparing the century without a winter. The 19th century thought it had solved the problem of cold. The furnaces roared, the chimneys coughed, and coal dust settled over cities like a second kind of snow. Black, permanent, reassuringly warm. Steam-powered factories, trains, ships. Heat had become mechanical, predictable. Humanity had conquered weather, or so it believed. And yet the warmth felt artificial. It hummed too loud, burned too bright, and smelled faintly of guilt. People no longer froze, but they began to choke instead. The smog in London dimmed the skies so thoroughly that lamps were lit at noon. In Paris, the sunsets glowed an eerie orange, the same hue once painted by volcanic ash. Progress, it seemed, was imitating disaster. But no one wanted to see that yet. The lesson of 1816 had been learned too well. Never be cold again. It didn't matter what burned, so long as it burned. Cities pulsed with a new rhythm. Heat, motion, noise. You could feel it in the streets, in the factories, in the ceaseless clatter of machines. The world had become restless, addicted to activity. People no longer trusted stillness. To pause felt dangerous, like inviting the frost back in. That's the hidden cost of fear. It never disappears. It just changes its clothes. The industrial age didn't just invent technology. It invented constant distraction. Noise became safety. Fire became faith. If the sun had failed once, humanity would build its own. Coal was their god now, black, silent, infinitely patient. And deep beneath that fire, buried in soot and pride, something new was forming. A feedback loop. The more the world tried to protect itself from the memory of cold, the more it began to warm the planet that had frightened it. Nobody noticed. Nobody could. The connection between furnace and sky wouldn't be understood for another 100 years. Still, you can sense the irony from here. A volcano had once cooled the earth for a single year. Humanity, in response, began to heat it for centuries. The people of that age couldn't have imagined such a thing. They were too busy surviving progress. The same coal that fueled the factories also filled lungs. The same warmth that banished frost now brought fevers. But to them it was a fair trade. The price of safety was discomfort. The price of control was dependence. Writers began to notice first, as they always do. Dickens, in London, described fog that never lifted, thick, yellow, chemical. The kind of air that felt alive, whispering secrets in every cough. Painters found romance in the haze, sketching skylines blurred by soot. Poets began to describe the modern city as both heart and furnace, a place that fed on itself to keep from going dark. The metaphors were beautiful, but the reality was less so. The weather began to change again, quietly this time. Winters grew milder. Glaciers retreated in mountain ranges no one was measuring yet. The air thickened, subtly, invisibly. No one thought to connect the dots. Why would they? The world had always felt unstable. This was just another quirk in its temperament. Meanwhile, scientists kept building better instruments, barometers, thermometers, spectroscopes. They thought they were studying nature, but in truth they were studying the echo of their own machines. The Industrial Revolution had given the world precision, but not peace. There's a strange symmetry in that. The volcano had been nature's eruption. Industry was humanity's reply. Both changed the sky. Both altered the course of history. But only one claimed to be progress. In coffeehouses and lecture halls, philosophers debated what it meant to be modern. Some said it was mastery, the ability to make the world obey. Others said it was defiance, the refusal to accept limits. A few, quieter voices wondered if modernity was simply denial, a refusal to remember. They weren't wrong. Every puff of smoke rising from a chimney was an act of collective forgetting, a small rebellion against the memory of cold fields and frozen children. And the forgetting worked. By the end of the century, hardly anyone alive remembered 1816 firsthand. The story had turned into legend, a curiosity told to school children in tones of awe. Once, they were told, the summer disappeared, but like all myths, it carried truth disguised as wonder. People didn't stop fearing the weather. They just transferred that fear elsewhere, to politics, to markets, to progress itself. When you can't control the sky, you start trying to control everything beneath it. And so the machine age became not just an age of innovation, but of obsession. Railways raced against distance, clocks measured every minute, maps filled every blank. The world was no longer content to exist, it had to be catalogued. To live without knowledge, without control, felt like standing under that gray sky again, waiting for the sun to come back. In the colonies, the empire exported this logic. Engineers measured rainfall in India, temperatures in Africa, tides in the Pacific. They called it science. It was, in its own way, an extension of trauma, a global attempt to make sure the world would never surprise them again. The irony, of course, was that it would, because the Earth never really forgets. The carbon released by those first furnaces is still in the air, still circling above us. A faint inheritance from a time when people were simply trying not to freeze. If you stand outside on a cold winter morning today, feel the hum of cars, the warmth rising from buildings. You are feeling the echo of that fear. The world is still trying to keep itself warm. It just doesn't know when to stop. That's the quiet curse of 1816. A planet that learned to love fire. What began as a desperate defense against ice has become a slow burn that may never end. But humanity didn't know that yet. They were too busy celebrating their victory over cold, drinking coffee under gas lamps, walking through cities that glowed like false dawns. They believed they had conquered the seasons, rewritten the laws of the earth, freed themselves from dependence on a fickle sun. And for a while it even seemed true. The nights were bright, the rooms were warm, the engines sang. Only the wind, when it rose at dusk, seemed to remember otherwise. It carried a faint whisper from a distant mountain, a reminder that warmth, like all gifts, comes with a debt, and someday that debt would come due. The 20th century began the way most centuries do, by pretending it had learned everything worth knowing. The machines were bigger, the cities brighter, the world more connected than ever before. Electricity crackled through wires, trains spanned continents, and the sky, once feared, had become a playground for balloons and airplanes. Humanity had made it official. Nature was no longer a threat. It was an achievement. And yet, under all that progress, something ancient still lingered. The same tremor that had rippled through Europe in 1816. That quiet fear of the sky, that sense that everything could vanish overnight. It was still there, humming in the background of civilization like static. Only now it was buried under confidence. Progress had become its own religion, complete with prophets and rituals. The prophets were scientists, the priests were engineers, and their miracle was warmth. Factories no longer just kept people alive. They kept people busy. Every new invention promised not just comfort, but safety, the assurance that humanity would never again be helpless before the cold. You could say that modern life itself was built on the ghost of a single winter. By the early 1900s, the world had learned to count its victories in degrees and horsepower. Oil replaced coal, engines replaced steam, and fire was everywhere, bottled, portable, obedient. The same flame that had once flickered on medieval torches now roared beneath steel ships and inside automobile engines. People called it progress. The planet called it combustion. No one noticed the irony yet. How could they? For the first time in history, warmth had become a birthright. In cities, gas lamps glowed through the night. In homes, radiators clanked with assurance. The fear of the cold had finally been tamed, not erased, but contained behind pipes and levers. The air outside, though, began to change. Slowly, invisibly. The first scientists to notice were laughed at. One Swedish chemist in the 1890s suggested that all this burning of coal might be warming the atmosphere. Nonsense, people said. The Earth is far too big for that. The idea that humanity could change the climate sounded as absurd as the idea that a volcano could destroy summer. And yet, both were true. The planet was remembering what humans had forgotten. The very machines designed to protect against cold were planting the seeds of heat. But that knowledge lay decades ahead, sleeping in equations and ignored papers. For now, the world was still drunk on invention. The trauma of 1816 had been transformed into optimism. Where once people saw fragility, they now saw opportunity. The same anxiety that had once prayed for sunlight now reached for stars. If a volcano could change the world by accident, perhaps humanity could do so on purpose, but better, safer, controlled. The word control appears in almost every document of the early 20th century. Control the market, control disease, control borders, time, destiny. It was the new gospel of modernity, and behind it, still whispering faintly, the voice of fear. Never again lose control. You can see it in everything they built. The Titanic, designed to defy nature itself. The skyscraper, stabbing into the clouds as if to pin them down. The airplane rising above weather instead of enduring it. Every invention was a retort to 1816, a rejection of helplessness. But the irony of mastery is that it always invents a new kind of vulnerability. When you depend on control for comfort, chaos becomes unbearable. And the 20th century, with its wars and smoke and rising temperatures, would have more than enough chaos to go around. Even art felt the strain. The romantic skies of Turner gave way to the fractured light of modernism. Painters stopped trying to capture weather. They started painting the feeling of disorientation itself. The world had become abstract, dizzying, hot, electric. People no longer looked up at the heavens for meaning. They looked down at the machines and wondered if they'd gone too far. And yet, the old story kept repeating. When Krakatoa erupted in 1883, its sunsets painted the world red again. People wrote about it with awe, calling it beautiful, sublime, even spiritual. No one mentioned famine this time. No one spoke of hunger. They had learned to aestheticize disaster. Volcanoes were no longer warnings. They were postcard material. That's the strange legacy of trauma once it becomes history. It loses its sting, gains elegance, and then repeats itself in disguise. By the mid-1900s, the planet was warming steadily. Glaciers that had outlived empires began to retreat. The poles thinned, the sea rose, and summers stretched longer. At first, people celebrated. Who would complain about mild winters and fertile fields? Perhaps, said one editorial in 1930, we are entering an age of perpetual summer. If the ghost of 1816 had a sense of humor, that was probably its favorite line. The year without a summer had created a species obsessed with preventing cold, and in doing so, It had taught that species how to burn forever. But that's the curse of progress. It solves problems by inventing bigger ones. After 2 world wars and 1 industrial boom, humanity had built enough fire to power entire continents. And to end them. The same hands that once prayed for warmth now held the atomic flame, capable of rewriting weather in a single flash. In that moment, Tambura's lesson came full circle. Power and destruction are always the same language, just spoken at different volumes. Even philosophy began to shiver again. Existentialism, born in the ashes of war, sounded eerily like the voice of a survivor describing the cold. Life was fragile, meaning was temporary, and control was illusion. History had gone in a perfect loop, from volcanic winter to nuclear summer, from too little sun to too much fire. And still, we kept pretending it was progress. By the 1960s, when scientists rediscovered those old warnings about the atmosphere, the irony was impossible to ignore. The smoke of progress had become its own kind of weather. Humanity had turned the memory of one lost summer into a permanent inheritance. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't even mistake. It was continuity. The Earth reacts, we respond. The cycle continues. The difference now is scale. In 1816, a mountain exhaled, and the world froze. 2 centuries later, humanity exhaled, and the world began to sweat. That's the debt of warmth, the one we're still paying. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of science and politics and denial, lies the same old thought, that maybe the seasons still remember us. Maybe the sky, too, has a memory. If the year 1816 was the moment humanity discovered that nature could betray it, then the 21st century is the moment nature discovered that humanity could betray it back. The pendulum had swung, slowly, patiently, over 200 years, from a frozen world begging for heat to a burning one begging for shade. It's strange, really. The same species that once huddled in fear under gray skies now lives beneath skies that are too bright, too hot, too full of its own reflection. The world has inverted itself. Summer is no longer a season. It's a condition. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that old cold in the way people talk about weather today. When the rain comes too late, when the snow refuses to fall, when the air feels wrong, people still reach for that same old word, unnatural. As if the seasons had personalities, as if the planet itself had moods. In a way, they're not wrong. The climate, after all, is the Earth's memory, and we've been writing in it for centuries. The irony is almost too neat to be believable. 200 years ago, a volcano darkened the sky and turned the world to ice. Today, a billion small fires do the opposite. One disaster came from beneath the Earth. The other floats in its atmosphere. But both tell the same story. That control is always temporary. Modern life, for all its sophistication, is still haunted by the same old instinct. The lights must stay on. The heat must stay running. The screens must glow. The comfort we built to protect ourselves from the memory of cold has become its own kind of cage. We call it convenience, but it's really dependence. The fire never went out, it just moved indoors. And so we live surrounded by warmth we can't quite turn off. Air conditioning hums through glass towers while glaciers crumble. Desert cities bloom in defiance of logic, growing food with borrowed water and borrowed time. The world is hotter than it's been in tens of thousands of years, and yet the fear that drives us is the same one that gripped the peasants of 1816. The fear of losing comfort, of being left out in the cold again. The difference is scale. Back then, a failed harvest could starve a village. Now, an overheated ocean can flood a continent. The balance we once feared losing has already shifted, but we're still pretending to hold it steady. Progress, it seems, has a longer fuse than anyone imagined. If you think about it, every light that burns at night is an echo of that old darkness. The city skyline at dusk looks almost volcanic from a distance. An inverted eruption, flame bursting upward instead of falling down. And maybe that's what civilization has always been. A slow, collective eruption, an attempt to rewrite the sky one what at a time. We've even inherited the same language of awe. When we see storms now, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, we describe them the way our ancestors described God's anger. Biblical, apocalyptic, wrathful. The vocabulary hasn't changed. Only the direction of blame has. The same volcano that once dimmed the sun for a season has become metaphor for everything we can't control. Economists talk about volatility, politicians warn of meltdowns, and scientists describe feedback loops. We don't use the word punishment anymore, but the tone hasn't softened much. The planet feels personal again, like it did in the Middle Ages. That's the quiet paradox of modernity. The more we understand the Earth, the more emotional it becomes. When satellites map the shrinking ice caps or chart the wildfires from orbit, what they're really seeing is the long shadow of 1816 still unfolding. We built a world designed to conquer the cold, and in doing so, we made warmth immortal. The furnaces we lit in fear have become the climate we live in. But even in that irony, there's a kind of fragile poetry. The Earth doesn't hold grudges. It just adjusts. Every degree of change is a negotiation between memory and consequence. The planet is still doing what it's always done, correcting itself. We're the ones who think correction should feel comfortable. Sometimes, when winter arrives late now, people talk about it in the same uncertain tone used in those old diaries. Strange weather this year, they say. Something feels off. And though they can't quite explain what they mean, they're right. Something does feel off. It's the rhythm of the planet, slightly out of tune. The music still plays, but the melody has shifted. You could almost imagine the Earth humming the same song it sang in 1816, just in a different key. Artists still chase that sound. Painters fill galleries with fiery skies. Filmmakers fill screens with frozen worlds, flooded cities, and forgotten suns. The apocalypse remains our favorite bedtime story. We still can't stop imagining the end, even as we live inside a slow-motion version of it. Maybe that's because the year without a summer never really ended. It just changed tempo, and beneath all the noise, beneath all the progress and protest, one truth remains. The world has always been fragile, and humans have always needed to believe they're not. When you trace the line from Tambora to today, it's hard not to feel a strange kind of tenderness for the species that started all this. A people terrified of freezing built a civilization that would never cool again. They didn't mean to break the balance. They were just trying to stay alive. That's the story of us, isn't it? Survival first, understanding later. But perhaps there's a quiet hope buried in that cycle. If fear can make us burn the world, maybe understanding can make us heal it. Maybe the same ingenuity that once turned ash to industry can now turn industry to restoration. History, after all, is a pendulum. It doesn't stop swinging, it just needs a new push. And maybe that push begins the same way the last one did, with weather. Because weather is memory, and memory can be rewritten. Imagine, centuries from now, someone reading about our time the way we read about 1816. Imagine them sitting by a dim light, whispering, "There was once a century when the summers burned." Maybe they'll shake their heads the way we do, wondering how anyone could have been so careless, so clever, so human. And maybe they'll remember us kindly, not as the ones who ended the world, but as the ones who finally learned to listen to it. Because the Earth, for all its silence, has always been talking. We just keep mistaking its voice for weather. The world is warmer now, but when the wind shifts in late spring, when the air turns cold for just a moment longer than it should, you can almost feel it. That quiet, uncanny echo of 1816. The year the sun dimmed, the summer that forgot itself, the season that rewrote us. It's strange how certain memories never fade, even if they don't belong to us. No one alive today felt that cold, yet it still hums beneath everything we do. You can hear it in the language of weather reports, the tone of news headlines, the quiet dread that sneaks into every conversation about the future. We speak like people who remember the dark even when standing in the light. Maybe that's what legacy really is, not fame, not monuments, but fear turned into instinct. Humanity doesn't consciously remember Tambora, but it still behaves like it does. Every light left burning at night, every thermostat adjusted higher, every city glowing from orbit. It's all a kind of ritual, a collective promise whispered to the ghosts of that long-ago winter. Never again. And yet, as promises go, it's a fragile one. Because even as we try to keep the dark at bay, the light keeps slipping away in different forms. The world hasn't grown crueler. It's just grown louder, hotter, busier. The calm that once came with cold has been replaced by motion, by heat, by endless human noise. The silence that terrified our ancestors has simply been drowned out. If you listen closely, though, beneath the hum of engines and the static of progress, there's still something else, a rhythm that doesn't belong to us. The slow, patient heartbeat of the earth. It beats through the ground we walk on, through the oceans that remember the ash, through the wind that still circles the globe. It's not angry, not vengeful, just steady. It's been keeping time since before language existed, and it will keep doing so long after our noise fades. The year without a summer was never really about punishment or apocalypse. It was about reminder. It showed us, in the quietest possible way, that we are guests here. Important, yes, but temporary, fragile, that the warmth we crave can vanish, that the seasons we trust can stumble, that the world doesn't need permission to change its mind. And maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe that's balance. Because for all our fires and fears, the truth is that humanity endures. Stumbles, it panics, it learns, and somehow always, it begins again. We've been adapting since before we had names for the stars. Every disaster we've faced has left behind a trace of wisdom, even if it takes centuries to find it. In the years after 1816, people built new tools, wrote new ideas, painted new skies. They turned pain into understanding. The volcano that nearly erased summer ended up giving us science, poetry, migration, memory. It connected the world through suffering and through curiosity, proved that even catastrophe can be a teacher. And maybe that's why the story endures. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's familiar. Every generation has its own version of 1816. Its own year when the world feels wrong, when the rules stop working, when the sky refuses to cooperate. Those are the moments when we remember how small we are, and how much beauty can still fit inside that smallness. If you close your eyes, you can picture it. A gray sky, an empty field, a family standing in the cold, unsure if the sun will ever return. They don't know it yet, but it will. It always does. Not because of faith or luck, but because the earth keeps breathing and life keeps answering. Somewhere right now, a volcano is sleeping. Somewhere else, a glacier is melting. The pendulum still swings, and we're still clinging to it, calling the motion progress. That's all civilization really is, a balancing act between fear and fire. But maybe we've grown wise enough now to see the pattern. To understand that survival isn't about conquering nature, it's about cooperation. About remembering the silence between the storms. About knowing that the world doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. If the summer of 1816 was a warning, then perhaps the centuries since have been its echo. A reminder that every light we build, every warmth we create, comes with the same responsibility. To leave room for the cold, to remember the night sky even when it burns with our own inventions. Because the cold, in its way, is what keeps us kind, teaches us hunger, humility, the fragile miracle of endurance. Without it, we forget why warmth matters at all. And so the story of the year it snowed in summer isn't really a tragedy. It's a parable, a quiet meditation on fragility, a bedtime story whispered by the planet to itself. Once, long ago, the earth breathed out and the world froze. People thought it was the end. It wasn't. It was just a reminder. The sun came back. The snow melted. The fields turned green again. And somewhere, deep in that thawing soil, something new began to grow: knowledge, awareness, a seed of understanding that would one day bloom into science, art, conscience. Every ending, after all, is only a pause in the weather. And as the wind fades, as the air warms, as the horizon glows again with that familiar golden haze, you can almost imagine the earth whispering to us, soft, amused, endlessly patient. I remember you too.